Thank you very much for joining us today. We're thrilled to be able to welcome you to Responsible Disruption and our 9th Innovation Table Zoomcast. My name is James Gamage, and I'm the Director of Innovation and the Social Impact Lab at the United Way of Calgary and area.
And my name is Monique Blau, and I'm the Director of Strategy and Design in the lab, and at J5, a Calgary-based innovation design firm. And we're co-hosts for Responsible Disruption. We're delighted to welcome our guests as we explore the future of sport. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we're currently gathered on the land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Apple River. The traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mokinttis, which we now call the city of Calgary. This is traditional land of the Blackfoot Confederacy, as well as Treaty 7 territory, which includes Kainai, Siksika, Piikani, Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda nations. We would also like to recognize the Métis people and the Inuit people who have made their home here in Calgary. With the sad events that are unfolding in the world today, we cannot remain silent. We stand against racism and intolerance in any form. We believe everyone deserves to live in equitable communities that are built on inclusion, diversity, understanding, and tolerance. At the Social Impact Lab, we strive to put people first, to create a diverse and inclusive culture where everyone feels safe and valued. Before we begin today, we'll just take a moment of silence. Thank you. Before we kick off in today's session, we have a few items we'd like to go through. The first is that we're recording this session, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues and friends, and we'll email you a link in the next couple days. The recording will also be available on our YouTube channel. And our next Responsible Disruption Innovation Table episode is on June 10th at 2 p.m. on adapting your business model and listening to your customer. But for today, we're going to be doing some quick introductions. We're going to have a delightful, exciting conversation. I'm setting the stage. We're going to turn it over to some audience questions, and then we'll also have a close. Because we want this to be interactive like all of our previous episodes, you'll notice there's a Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom panel. Please use that to post your answers throughout the session today, and we'll get to as many as we can. Over to you, James.
So to frame today's conversation, let's talk a little bit about responsible disruption. So our social systems are being disrupted, and there is demand for new ideas, solutions, products, and services. This demand for support continues to outpace the supply of funding. We in the Social Impact Lab, which is a partnership between J5 and the United Way of Calgary and area, are responding to this disruption by investing in innovation, which we are calling responsible disruption, ensuring that any change that results is considered and fair to Calgarians and communities. Our Responsible Disruption Zoomcasts are a series of discussions with leading players about the disruption they are feeling in their own fields of specialism. Whether you're an armchair fan, a weekend warrior, or an elite sportsman, your ability to enjoy the sport that you love has been destroyed in recent weeks. Social and physical distancing measures have led to the cancellation or postponement of every global, national and local sporting event, including the 2020 Summer Olympic and Paralympic Games in Tokyo, as well as the curtailment of group training and recreational activities. The global value of the sports industry is estimated at $756 billion annually, and many jobs have been put at risk, not only for sports professionals, but also for those in related retail and sporting services. And the contribution that sport makes to the empowerment of individuals and communities, as well as to health, education, and social inclusion has been lost. Today, we will hear from 3 leading lights in the Canadian Olympic movement about the impact of the lockdown to elite athletes, as well as those at the grassroots level. What will be the impact of postponing the Summer Games? What will junior, local and recreational sport look like as we slowly transition back to normal? And how can sport be a force for good in the troubling times in which we live?
So we're going to kick it off by introducing our guests. So we'll start with David Shoemaker. He is the Chief Executive Officer and Secretary General for the Canadian Olympic Committee. He brings 20 years of experience in the sports industry and is an accomplished global sports executive and a trusted name in sports, business, and law, having worked in New York at the beginning of his law career. Before joining the COC, David spent 7 years as CEO of NBA China and was instrumental in bringing that work forward, and also spent 7 years at the Women's Tennis Association and serving as president in 2009 and 2011. David oversees the board scope of operations for the Olympic movement in Canada, including the National Sports Development Programs, Team Canada preparation, and bids. And he also works closely with the 52 national federations of sport to provide tools and support they need to develop our next Olympians. Our next guest is Mark Tewksbury, and I'm sure everyone knows him as well. He is a legend, a champion, and an Olympic icon. And Mark first came to prominence as an Olympic gold medalist, which I got to see. And he has truly had a remarkable career, not only as an athlete, but post-Olympics. And this is what really defines him. In 1998, Mark made front page news when he came out as the first openly gay Olympic champions in the world. And since that time, he has used his voice and ever-evolving leadership positions within the Olympic movement and beyond to make a difference for others. Mark ran for a board position on the Canadian Olympic Committee in 2017 and currently sits as a director. Mark's ongoing fight for justice, fair play, and equal rights is what defines him and is truly a unique Olympic icon who reaches far beyond sport. Our final guest I'd like to introduce is Scott. And Scott Russell is a Canadian Screen Award and Gemini Award-winning broadcaster and acclaimed author. I'm sure many of you have seen him on the road to Olympic Games, where he co-hosts alongside Andy Petrello every weekend. A CBC sports veteran with more than 25 years, Russell has covered 14 Olympic Games and numerous other professional sports. In addition to his roles as CBC, Scott is a member of the Canadian Olympic Committee's Education Committee. He serves on the advisory panel for the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport and Public Policy Forum on Value-Based Sport. Scott currently serves on the selection committees for the Lou Marsh Award, Canada's Athlete of the Year, and the Toronto Sports Hall of Honor. Welcome each of you, and thanks for joining us today. So just a reminder to the audience, don't forget that you can use the QA button to ask some questions so we can get through them. But to start this off, we know we're all here, of course, to talk about responsible disruption, but also because we all have a passion for sport, the Olympic movement, and what the future of sport might look like. And this question is for each of you, but I'd like to start it off with Mark. What is it about sports and the Olympics that hooked you and led you to where you are today?
Thanks, Monique. Hi, everyone. I was an 8-year-old kid watching the 1976 Olympics on television. And I guess I realized when I was down in Rio in 2016 with Scott covering the success of the Canadian team there, when they won 6 medals, and it was so exciting. It gave a context to me of being an 8-year-old kid watching Canada win 8 medals in the swimming pool in front of a home audience. And I think that joy of competition, the excellence, the thrill of victory, the crowd, all of it obviously spoke to me. But then when I became an Olympian, it really changed. And I think what I love so much about the Olympics is the incredibly unique experience of being in the athletes' village and the athletes' cafeteria in the Olympic Village, where you're surrounded by athletes from 204 countries in the world. And you're doing so peacefully and you're coexisting. And I know it sounds Pollyanna, but it speaks to the humanity, the similarity to all of us wherever we're from. And I guess in today's time and what we're going through right now, I think that's maybe more important than ever.
Thanks for that. Mark, I think that's a great place to start. I love the memories that first kind of hook us and then, circle back. David, how about yourself?
Thanks, Monique. And before I answer, just a word of appreciation for starting the webinar off with a moment of silence. Just on behalf of the Canadian Olympic Committee, we're hurting and we're concerned. And we don't have all the answers. We certainly know we need to aspire to do better in addressing inequality and injustice to Black communities in our society. And for starters, what we're doing is amplifying the voices of those who authentically and credibly speak to this topic. And stay tuned for that, and stay tuned for more. But I wanted to make sure I commented on that. Very important, very challenging time for all of us. For me, like Mark, it started with television. And yet I didn't become a world-class athlete, but I was inspired by Steve Podborski. For me, I was a young, aspiring 9-year-old ski racer who skipped school. I now verify that I skipped school because it was a Thursday in Lake Placid in 1980, where Calgary's Ken Reid was holding the hopes of most Canadians to win a medal in the downhill. And his ski binding released on the second or third gate, and our hopes seemingly dashed were recovered by Podborski, who won a bronze medal and inspired a whole country. I thought it was the most momentous medal in Canadian Olympic history then, and still feels pretty significant now. But it inspired me to do everything I think better. Work harder to earn that little pocket change to buy that, ski wax, or work harder at school so I could justify those out of school training days. But from that moment, and it wasn't limited to Olympic sport, it was frankly all sport. I got the bug. And for me, because I was a mediocre athlete, I turned it into a professional career, but in my case, as an administrator in sport, for which I consider still my own Olympic dream come true.
Thanks for that. That's great. Your own Olympic dream. So I'm hoping you've got some medals there that are starting to line up for yourself in your own way.
Papier-mâché medals, perhaps. Yes.
I love that, it started from TV. And Scott, we want to bring you in on this conversation, and you are in TV. So what was the first memories for you?
Well, thanks, Monique. And let me just say it's great to be on this panel to discuss the future of sport in certainly very challenging times. And I think it's an important discussion to have. My first memory of the Olympic Games is through TV. It's with my father. The 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City. And I remember my dad taking me to the television set and watching the Canadian equestrian team win the gold medal in '68 before 100,000 people in Mexico City. I'd never seen anything that big in my life, but it was also at those Olympic Games that Tommy Smith and John Carlos raced their hands in a fist atop the podium, and that became the focus of the world and their demonstration for Black power at that point in time. And isn't it funny, all these years later, that we're still talking about the same thing? But what made me really impressed about the Olympics and created a sense of wonder for me was the ability of the Games to congregate people. It was the world's largest gathering, and it continues to be. And when the Olympic Games occur, winter and summer, it seems to me that the world stops and takes notice. It's a very important congregation. I learned further about the Olympics when I went to summer camp in Haliburton, Ontario, and we recreated the Olympics by having a 2-day mini Olympics, divided the camp into 5 different countries that we had never heard of, but we assumed those identities. And for 2 days, we were part of the Olympic gathering. And it was a real education and continues to be for me. It's a sense of wonder of the world's greatest gathering.
Oh, I love how you say that, the world's greatest gathering. Thank you, each of you, for sharing a bit of your memories and giving us a little bit of an insight into each of you. You know, it's a great way to start our conversation today, but we all know that we're all experiencing a changing world almost daily. And James summarized it really perfectly at the beginning of what's occurring in our world of sports at all levels, elite athletes, but also down to the local baseball diamond. So the pandemic has changed the landscape of sport, has changed how we look at sport, has changed what we're thinking might be next. But I'd really like to unpack what might have been working before these pre-pandemic times. And so David, maybe we could start with you. Could you share with us what you think was working? And then also maybe we can look at what wasn't working in sport in Canada. And I'd like us to explore both from the grassroots level, but also up to the elites.
Well, what was working is something I think I can be very boastful about because it preceded my role as CEO of the Canadian Olympic Committee. And that's that Canadian athletes and teams are and have been performing at an exceptionally high level at the Olympic Games in both the winter and summer games. And we don't need to look very far back. Our performance in Pyeongchang, 29 medals, third in the world, was the highest single medal total for us in the Winter Games, and really has us very close to the very top. That's to me a credit to lots of things, including an infrastructure that's been built up over the years and the legacy of games we've hosted. Summer Games in Rio in 2016, 22 medals, 10th in the world, also a high. There's an asterisk there, a high for a non-boycotted games, I believe is the asterisk, but I still think that is a high watermark. So a country of 37 million people, not nearly as well funded, and I'm not talking about not nearly as well funded by the comparison to the powerhouses of the United States or Russia or China, but compared to the other countries that we compare ourselves, we're outspent. Probably we're outinvested 7 times by Great Britain and 4 times by Australia, and yet we compete at this marvelously high level. What's not working is something that, as Mark knows well from his board seat, access to sport. And so I'll swing now to sort of the grassroots level, the other end of the sport continuum, as we like to talk about it, that 12% of our national sports federations' budgets are spent on the development of their sport. It's woefully inadequate. And what we've seen in that is that what used to be something we take for granted, that I could go as a young child and play soccer in my community or softball in my community at relatively little expense, has priced many families out, or they have to make choices. Will it be hockey or soccer or basketball, but not all of them. And this is particularly acute for certain groups of Canadians who have traditionally not had that access. So Indigenous Canadians, women and girls, people with disabilities, new Canadians, and people in economic need. So we've been, prior to COVID, pre-COVID days, we were lobbying the government quite heavily for a $40 million increase to funding, not for the Canadian Olympic Committee, but for the member federations so that they could invest far more in the development of sport.
Monique, I think I'm going to jump in because we did this independently and I came up with what's working. I put Team Canada, similar to David. But I want to just explain that I'm coming at it from more of an athlete point of view. And I'll say that like in Vancouver 2010, it was a really amazing experience for the athletes. And I think most left those Olympics and realized being one unified Canadian team led to this enormous success, like 14 gold medals, just unheard of. And that is rippled out. That's now one unified total Olympic team between the summer and the winter. The athletes share knowledge and know each other and are friends. And that's pretty special. There's that momentum that's allowed that team to keep performing. And the reason that's important is because it provides that inspiration that makes that 8 or 10-year-old go with their local sport program. I want to be whomever. We saw that after Penny Alexiak, right? We saw that in tennis last year after Bianca. Like, it's just this natural correlation, which leads me to agreeing also what isn't working. I'd say what has to work is the Canadian sports system. It just has to. It has to be more accessible, because that's where the next generation of Olympians are going to come from. The whole thing feeds itself. So if we don't have access for new Canadians and Indigenous peoples and other groups that maybe haven't traditionally had as much access, it's going to impact the health of our country, and funny enough, ultimately the performance of the Canadian Olympic team, because the broader the base, obviously the more talent that emerges to get to that very high performance elite level. What isn't working for me remains this challenge of hosting games, especially major games. I mean, it feels, and no offense to other groups, I feel a little bit like sometimes, maybe hosting a games is like a hot potato. Somebody says they're going to take it, then they drop out, and then another city pops up. And I think that's happening with the Commonwealth Games as we speak. The Olympics used to be so illustrious to host. In 1996, there were 11 cities bidding to host the 2004 Summer Olympic Games. And now fast forward to 2 cities only emerging for both the 2022 and 2026 Winter Games, and basically 2 cities emerging for the Summer Games. And the IOC said, wow, you can have one and you can have the other, and let's buy ourselves some time. So I know that Agenda 2020 is looking at solving some of these challenges, but they've got a long way to go. If you look at recent history of 2014 in Sochi and 2016 in Rio, and a devastatingly disappointing legacy that's attached to those games of facilities and social change post-games. What good did it really do those countries? And I think that needs to be something always considered front of mind when deciding who hosts games in the future. If we're going to disrupt it, this has to be one of the disruptions. What's the legacy sustainability piece legitimately, and not let any city get away with the kind of legacy Sochi and Rio left behind.
If I can follow up on what Mark has said, I think what was working prior to the pandemic in the Canadian sports system had less to do with performance. And I know it's wonderful as fans of sport in this country that Canadian athletes are doing well and winning medals on the world stage and on the Olympic stage. It's absolutely brilliant to see that happen, because there's something to cheer for. But what was working in our sports system is that I think Canada has been a beacon and continues to be for value-based sport. Many of our Canadian athletes are leaders in the realm of the fight against doping in sport. I think about Becky Scott and the role she played at the World Anti-Doping Agency, where she was head of the Athletes Commission, and she was a strong fighter for the fight against doping in sport. I think that the Canadian Olympic Committee has been particularly strong in furthering the principle of inclusion, that every Canadian has the ability to be an Olympian and to wear the colors of Team Canada. I think that Canada is also a leader in parasport, and the Canadian Paralympic Committee is doing great work and is noted for that internationally, because as the founder of the modern Olympic Games, Baron Pierre de Coubertin once said, all sport for all people. And I think in Canada, we have taken that to heart, and we've tried to make that possible. What's not working is accessibility to sport at the grassroots level. Too many Canadians, racialized Canadians, those who face economic challenges, don't have access to sport because they can't afford it. And here's another thing. One of the things that is becoming apparent is that sport is not a positive thing for every Canadian and for people who are involved. There are too many cases of abuse in sport. abuse on the part of coaches and those that oversee sport. And one of the things that I think is not working about our sports system in terms of accessibility is that sport and physical education, which we all agree is a good thing and beneficial to people, should be part of the core curriculum of our schools in every city and province in the country. And in that way, sport will become accessible and affordable for everyone.
Okay, I'm going to jump in too, just to keep it interesting. First of all, a shout out to United Way Calgary that I know is looking at creating programs for kids to get more access, because that's this part of this responsible disruption is to actually take some action, and that's a local action that's happening. I love, Scott, that you gave a shout out to Becky Scott, who's doing incredible things. And I would agree that we've been a bit of an international beacon for values-based sport. But I still think there's so much work to do. And to David's point at the beginning, you know, I look around the Olympic Committee board and there's one Black person. It's Shay Smith, our athlete representative from athletics. We need to do better than that. But as a country, we have, you know, I was an openly gay chef de mission in 2012. That's a pretty big deal in the world of sport, that could happen in a country when many of the countries I was marching beside, I could still be arrested or worse for my sexuality. For gender equality, you know, we've got a female woman leading our organization, Tricia Smith, that's also an IOC member, and many of our teams have, with our women athletes, have either equal or been more than our male athletes on the past number of Olympic teams. So in some areas we're doing great, and I think I think what it shows is that when we put our mind to an issue, we can make change happen, and it's time to make change happen also for other marginalized communities.
Thanks for that, Mark and Scott and David. Wow. I feel we could have an entire show just around what does, you know, future leadership of sport look like, and how can we create opportunities for inclusivity and access to sport, at a grassroots level. Why don't we move to something that we know is exciting, is the new dates that have been established for Tokyo. And I'm actually looking maybe to you, Scott, for this to start, because when we think about your role in the road to the Olympic Games and what people look forward to on seeing on TV, maybe you could share with our audience today what you're looking forward to most.
I have to say, Monique, that I'm most looking forward to the world congregating again. I think one of the things that is so difficult about this time is that sport doesn't exist in isolation. Sport is something which is shared by all of humanity. Sport is something which builds communities. And the thing I'm looking forward to most about the Olympics in Tokyo and the Paralympic Games in Tokyo in the summer of 2021 now, that's the target at least, is that the world will find a way to congregate again and to come together. You know, what's most ominous about this, and you know, I think we have to talk about it, is the prospect of sport which will exist without fans in the stands. And that to me is something that is a shame. I know there is a safety concern involved with what's been happening with the pandemic, but I think the beauty of sport is that it brings people together. And my hope is, and what I look forward to most, is that we can come together in Tokyo in the summer of 2021, and the Olympic movement and the Paralympic movement can continue to do their good works. I have to tell you, I've been to 14 Olympic and Paralympic Games, and there is nothing like being in the stadium when the 100 meters is run, or in the swimming pool when the 100-meter backstroke is run, as it was in 1992 when Mark Tewksbury won the gold medal. There is nothing like that common sharing of the spectacular moment that sport affords. And I can't wait for that to happen again. I think it's a good thing for the world, and it will be a huge part of our healing process.
Thanks. I think the healing process is a journey. And, you know, when we look at also, David, you deal every day with the athletes that have been going through this, I can't imagine, a roller coaster of sorts. And what are you hearing from them and from the people that you're surrounded by every day around this new opportunity that's set ahead?
Yeah, look, the athletes are incredibly resilient and tremendous role models. And I have to say, I don't know where that comes from. Is it in the drinking water in Canada? But I mean, I keep meeting more and more of them in the time that I've been in this role, and I continue to get impressed. And it makes us want to put them up in front of more and more Canadians and share their points of view. And it's worth noting that when Canada became the first nation to put up its hand and say, we're standing down from training, we're not going to go to the Tokyo Games in 2020, in the summer of 2020, because it's not safe to do so. It was our athletes that led that. It was Shea Smith, it was Rosie McLennan, it was our chef de mission, Marnie McBean, and many, many others who, and this wasn't a selfish thing. This wasn't saying it's not safe for me. They were saying it's not safe for my family. It's not safe for my communities. I'm going to try to sneak out the door and train for the Olympic Games when the public health advocate, Teresa Tan's, telling us we've got to stay indoors and socially distance, and that's not right. So I admire them a lot. As resilient as they are, they're also athletes. And so, you know, as caged as I feel in my home and want to get out and run every day and cycle and walk and other activities, you can imagine how itchy they are to get back to training. And so we've hit this point where they see the return to sport happening in other parts of the world. There's certainly a lot of talk about it, and it's beginning to happen in professional sport. That while I wouldn't call it pressure, athletes are starting to say, okay, now what's our plan? And so we've recently unveiled a whole set of guidelines around return to sport. And then just this week, the Canadian Olympic Committee, in partnership with the Canadian Paralympic Committee and On the Podium, announced a $5 million investment that we're going to put into the safe and healthy return, so that athletes can, frankly, prioritize public health again, just as they did when they elected to stand down.
I didn't realize, actually, when we made that decision as a Canadian Olympic Committee, what a responsible disruption, literally, that was, to say we won't send our athletes at this moment in time. But, you know, we all have to sit back and think there's this ominous warning of, you know, if it doesn't happen in those dates, it's not going to happen. And so then what? And I think if we're talking about responsible disruption, obviously all of us have had to think, so what happens then? What if the best part of the Olympics is bringing everyone together? What if that can't happen anymore? But I guess I have faith that we will figure it out. And worst case scenario, we buy time. You know, the Olympics essentially are a number of world championships brought together under one incredible banner in one place. Potentially short term, that might have to change how that looks, but we will find a way through, because I just can't imagine a world without the Olympic Games. It's one of, and Paralympic Games especially, the impact that the Paralympic Games has had in cities from London to Rio. You know, it's gaining momentum and helping have so much exposure to members of societies, especially in places like Brazil, that perhaps haven't ever had that before. So there's something so important about it beyond the sport. And it is one of those rare occasions where you'll see athletes in the Olympic Village walking from Syria and Iraq and Iran together and sitting in a cafeteria, and you think, how can this happen here? And if it can happen here, why can't it happen in other places?
Can I'm just going to add to this conversation, if I might, that, you know, I think that there is a reasonable chance, particularly as we see the opening up of football and basketball and hockey's plans, and the US Open just announced recently that they don't think there will be fans in the stands in tennis. this coming August and September, that the Olympic Games in Tokyo may well be competed in front of no spectators or no appreciable number of spectators. And that would make me sad. Certainly I share Scott's hope that we can congregate as quickly as possible. But we, at the outset of this webinar, Mark, Scott, and I talked about being inspired over television. And the reality is that while tens of thousands of people experience the Olympic Games when they occur in person, billions of people around the world experience them through broadcast media. And if there were ever a time with all the different social media platforms, digital media outlets, and broadcast TV outlets that proliferate in the world, if there were ever a time that we could make the Olympic Games work without fans, it presumably is in 2021. And so while we despair at that notion, we're planning to think about that as an opportunity to think about delivering digital services and experiences, behind the scenes looks that we've never delivered before. And perhaps converting, frankly, something that we hope to never see into a bit of an opportunity for us.
I think David's right that it could be a huge opportunity to have the Olympic Games staged in whatever form. And if that has to be without fans, so be it. A world with the Olympics and without fans is better than a world without the Olympics. I would say, though, that what would be missing for me, and particularly for the athletes, and I think that you can tell, they will tell you that their performance is heightened by the crowd which they perform in front of. And I think that goes without question. And I think there are many concerns being raised by professional sports players, by Olympians, by high performance athletes. How do we escalate our performance in the absence of those who cheer?
Just for the record, I share wanting to come back to as quickly as possible too. I joined that. I'm in there too.
Yeah, I mean, it strikes me it's a really interesting challenge from an athlete's point of view, because the energy and the adrenaline that they would get from a noisy, active crowd must be incalculable from a performance point of view. So, interesting point. Can I just jump in and actually? One of the things we want this to be is interactive with the audience, and we got a couple of questions in there in the box, the question box at the moment. But please feel free to ask away. We'll have some time for questions towards the end of the hour. But before then, I just wanted to poke about something that you talked about, Mark, around the lack of cities bidding for the Olympics and how that's changed in recent years. And seeing as we're in Calgary, I have to ask you about the failed Calgary 2026 plebiscite and what went wrong from your point of view, and what lessons do you think can be learned from it?
So I get to start this one. All right. Thanks a lot, James. Listen, I think David will speak to this organizationally, because I think there was definitely at that sort of Canadian Olympic Committee being basically the rights holder of Olympics or the conduit to the International Olympic Committee in Canada. There's a piece there. From a local Calgarian perspective, I just think, and it's not Mary and Scott at the end, they inherited something that lacked vision from the start. It was really a committee of city council was set about to basically do an expense report on what it would be to cost the Olympics exploration. And it was such a weird thing. It was like, they aren't really the exploratory bid, they're the committee that's the exploratory bid. Like, they were always once removed from anything. And so I just feel like by the time that it got to the citizens of Calgary really understand the Olympics, it had been completely tainted by budgets and numbers and lack of vision. And I tease about, when you do these big build projects or these big scale projects, if you don't provide the vision, then there's no incentive for it to happen. So I just, in a summary, lack of vision from the start, and able to make it compelling for Calgarians that had every reason to love having the Olympics again, somehow turn against it.
Can I jump in here? And I agree with Mark concerning the lack of vision. And that, to me, that was not a problem of Mary Moran or Scott Hutchison, who were involved in trying to put this bid forward. But what happened was that as time evolved and we got closer to the plebiscite, the potential of a bid became more of a burden and seen as more of a burden than as an opportunity. And the failure was to sell it as an opportunity for the city and for the country to grow around sport and hosting the Olympic Games again. And what was most disturbing was that athletes who had long been seen as a credit to that community in Calgary were seen somehow or cast in the light of being elitists wanting to stage another party for their own benefit. And that, from my point of view as an observer, became really disturbing, because I knew many of those champions who lived in Calgary and who were very, devout about their attachment to the potential of hosting the Olympic Games again. And to see them denigrated was disturbing.
Yeah, thank you. And David, do you have any comments from a COC point of view?
Oh, sure. I've got a lot to add, and we should. I've been part of a host of debriefs among everyone that was part of the bid committee, Sport Canada and the federal government in Ottawa, our own team. And I think we've got to take some serious responsibility ourselves at the Canadian Olympic Committee and say, this is an area where we must do a better job going forward. There are a ton of lessons learned, but it's sort of, to me, the wrong approach from the Canadian Olympic Committee standpoint is to treat it like kind of an application process, that the city has interest in hosting the Olympic Games. They come to us and, figuratively, we turn over and find where the file drawer is and pull out the application form and hand it back to them and sort of say, good luck, we'll take your application in. That I think we have to be much more forward leaning, that we have to decide for ourselves, do we want the Olympic Games, and when and where and why, and be part of the group that sells that vision alongside the mayor and the chair of the organizer or the bid committee and so on. So I think that's central, and that's a lesson we've learned, that as and when we think about games going forward, Winter Games or Summer Games, that we just have to be right there from the get-go. Or else it's doomed to a certain result. The other thing I'll mention, I kind of refer to this with my friends as the Dos Caminos factor. Bear with me. It's a restaurant in New York City that I went to with my friends, and my one friend, Mitch, thought it was the best steak he'd ever eaten. And so we decided to return to Dos Caminos. And on the second occasion, no offense to anybody who goes to the restaurant, it was, of course, not nearly as good. And so I've used that, that as a reminder that when you do things a second time around, no matter how great the first experience was, you have to, do one better, or you just have to see it, not order the steak, for example, and order something else. And Calgary 1988 was an incredible success. I think Juan Antonio Samaranch called them the best games ever. And the legacy continues. In the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics that I referenced, of the 29 medalists, 23 of those medals can be traced to training facilities built for the 1988 Calgary Games. So what do we tell the citizens of Calgary when it's time to do it all over again? I think the message has to be completely different, or else we haven't answered the why very effectively. We really have to address that Dos Caminos factor. What do we benefit from having this come back to our city the second time around?
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump in there because I love this conversation because it links from grassroots to elite so easily. And here's the thing, what David just talked about, those facilities that still are producing 23 of 29 medalists are now in jeopardy. And so after, what the games would have done is, of course, kept fueling that, which then inspires the next generation, but it also has facilities that have access. Without those facilities, guess what? Access continues to go down. It gets harder and harder for people to participate in sport. So it really feeds itself. And it was why it was so disappointing. I understand how the argument sort of got derailed and Calgarians saw the games in a certain way, but unfortunately the connectivity to actually long-term, what that means to quality of life for grassroots local kids took a hit because of us not going forward for Calgary 2026.
1988, the Olympic Winter Games in Calgary were significant because of the characters that were involved. I mean, you had Eddie the Eagle Edwards, the British ski jumper, the Jamaican bobsled team. You had the Battle of the Bryans, Orser and Boitano in figure skating. Alberto La Bomba Tomba, the alpine skier who created a sensation. But it was also really significant, Calgary 1988, because they were the first big city winter games. And that's where Calgary made its huge splash. They were a great spectacle, and they created this wonderful legacy for sport in a big city in a northern country in Canada. And I know this for a fact, that the International Olympic Committee wanted Calgary to bid for 2026 because they knew that Calgary could become a model for a new version of the Olympics, for a more sustainable version of the Olympics. They wanted Calgary to be the model, and that's the vision that we failed to sell in Calgary. Calgary could have become a leader again in a new version of the Olympics, more sustainable and a more modern Olympics.
And the other challenge, Scott, there was no real political leadership that people could trust that said that there was just made a comment in our chat. And it was a very fair point that, there wasn't the political leadership either to say, this is how this is going to be good for you, that the taxpayers could really buy into. So when you get David's point with, the COC not being involved early enough, the bean counting starting, the distrust of politicians, it just led to, of course, what we saw happen, which we all learned from going forward.
Yeah, and just on Scott's point, I know from back over the pond, the one thing that I said to people when I said I was coming to Calgary was, oh, I remember that from the Olympics in 1988, all those years later. So the legacy and the vision, I think, was wanting a little bit, but the question also came down to affordability, and I think that's common when the Olympics are talked about in many jurisdictions. What can the Olympic movement do about that? Are there other models that they can create that perhaps make the Olympics more affordable in the future? Anyone can jump in on that one.
Well, I'll start. I believe it's paying very close attention to and supporting the bids that are, we think of them as the responsible bids, a bid that involves next to no infrastructure projects in order to take place, as opposed to an enormous amount of construction of undertakings of venues that have no legacy plan involved. It's quite saddening to me to see, news that many of the venues in Rio just 4 years ago are being shut for safety concerns. Or if I draw from my tennis experience, the Athens Games in 2004, a brand new tennis facility was built in Athens, but was built with a hard court because that was what the international tennis event required for the Olympic Games. And yet if that was going to have any chance of hosting a professional tennis tournament in the future, it had to have clay courts throughout it, and it was not capable of being converted to clay courts for drainage and other reasons. Immediately mothballed post the Olympic Games. And so I think there has to be a hard trend toward much more responsible bids. And Mark alluded to earlier, the IOC's Agenda 2020. It's this notion that the IOC itself has put up its hand and said, we're willing to be far more flexible than we ever have before to seeing geographic dispersion from, the host city to a potential venue. And that's very important, particularly in winter games, when, we're realizing that as a nation here in Canada, it's very hard to support, let's just say, even one ski jumping facility, let alone more than one ski jumping facility. So imagine if we ever got the courage to back a bid for the Winter Games in Quebec City. I mean, we'd have to convince the IOC, I think, that the ski jumping should take place in Whistler. That's a long way from Quebec City. But I think the IOC said they're prepared to consider those kinds of models because they'd much prefer to see an existing facility get used than a new one get built.
I think the trend, as David says, has to be towards supporting responsible bids for the games, to be creative in terms of accepting geographical and regional bids. One of the things that I have a concern about is that if we start to centralize the Olympics into a series of rotating permanent locations, that we will be taking away another element of accessibility to sport. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here, and I've brought this up before. Sebastian Coe, who is a two-time Olympic champion, the man who was the organizer of the London 2012 Olympics and now the president and CEO of World Athletics. I ran into him in New Delhi at the Commonwealth Games in 2010, and there was tremendous consternation about why we were hosting a major games in one of the world's most populous countries with sketchy conditions, so to speak, because it was impoverished. And he said, look, if you want sport to grow, and if you want sport to be accessible to all people, sometimes you have to take it out of the safety of your own backyard. You have to support it, you have to take some risks, and you have to be creative. And I think the onus right now is on the International Olympic Committee to get creative how they are going to support the hosting of Olympic Games. They have to do a bigger part, and they have to put not so much onus on local organizing committees who, quite frankly, run the danger of becoming forever indebted by hosting the games.
Yeah, and to jump just in real quick, I mean, to that point, it was really important the Olympics went to South America for the first time. But unfortunately, it was done in a way that didn't benefit the Olympic movement or Rio de Janeiro or Brazil. So, I'm all for, I agree with Scott, like the Olympics, there was an Olympic bid in that 2004 group of 11 cities that came from Cape Town. And it was a solid African bid. But does it make sense for Africa to host the Olympics in the current model? And, I think the current model does favor different countries, Western developed countries, authoritarian regimes. But I do think there's a way to do it differently. And I think that Canada, looking to the future of sport, could be a player in that. I really believe that.
Well, and doing it differently means also dropping expectations of what's required. I mean, I referred to, existing infrastructure versus building infrastructure. But, when we think of Canada and we think about how many cities have an Olympic stadium capable of housing a track and hosting the opening ceremonies, there are not many. And so what we have to say to ourselves is the IOC prepared to be more flexible in terms of attendance at an opening ceremony? Or what number of bleachers have to surround a track for it to be an Olympic track. Because frankly, only with that flexibility will a city in Africa, let's say, get to where we need it to get to without having to build colossal infrastructure that will, ruin its finances for years to come.
Oh, thank you. Now, I'm really conscious of time, and we're running pretty short, but I just want to ask one of the questions that actually come into the question box, and it was, what are your most inspiring moments you have witnessed live at a sporting event? If you can just name one, and just name one, and if we can keep it quick, because we're going to have to, we're coming up to the top of the hour. So can I ask you first, Scott?
Absolutely, and it involves a Calgarian by the name of Kyle Schoefelt, and 2004 Olympics in Athens, Greece. No Canadian had ever won a medal at the Olympic Games in gymnastics, and Kyle Schoefelt won gold on the floor exercise. He raised his arm in victory, hugged his coach, went to the mix zone, and there he hugged another great Canadian Olympian, Katrina LeMay-Doan. Inspiring.
Cool. Thanks.
I'll jump in next. I'm going to say when I was chef de mission for the London 2012 team, like every day there was a moment, but the one that made me spontaneously burst into tears was Brent Hayden's bronze medal in the 100-meter freestyle in the pool. He won it by hundreds, and it could have been third or seventh. And then Dick Pound, long-standing IOC member, gave him his bronze medal. That was a pretty cool moment.
And David?
Well, the key here is witness in person, and I'm usually in the bowels of a building or somewhere in a meeting room. So I'm going to go next generation Olympian, or new Bianca Andreescu, winning the Rogers Cup in Toronto by walkover, or by default, I guess, retirement. Serena Williams pulled out of the tournament when it was pretty clear that Bianca was going to beat her. And Bianca, this is her second major tournament to ever win, in effect winning the Canadian Open, and had the poise and the maturity, the grace to go to Serena and comfort Serena, who was in tears. And it just felt so amazing to me, but also so Canadian to me. And so I thought that was awfully inspiring.
I love that. Those are great. I can't believe we've come really to the end of our session today. And thank you to our guests. David, Mark, Scott, you're all eminent figures truly in Canadian sports, and it was a pleasure to be able to spend some time with you. This won't be the last conversation we have on the future of sport. We are going to be doing a series, but I think what's left most for many of us probably on this call is that you're all advocates for sports, advocates for sport and community. And how do we look at inclusivity? I love what's working with Team Canada, but as a designer, I love the opportunity to think about how can we disrupt the sports system and what can we do together to make that possible. I look forward to the next conversation. For our audience members, just a reminder that the session was recorded. It's available on YouTube in the next couple of days, and we'll also be sending you a link so that you can share it with your friends and family. In addition to that, a reminder of our next episode, June 10th, and we'll be discussing adapting your business model and responding to customer needs with guests from Proof and Vine Arts and the Calgary Airport. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and we want you to all be safe and to be healthy.